You're listening to Mammal Watching with Charles Foley and John Hall. You can find other episodes at mammalwatching.com/podcast.
Welcome to the Mammal Watching podcast with me, John Hall in New York.
And me, Charles Foley in Minneapolis. John, I understand that you are just about to start a trip to Europe.
I am. I'm going off to see my kids and, more importantly, to see some mammals. And then even more importantly, to see you and some mammal watchers in Spain, Charles.
Yes, indeed. We will meet up in near Oviedo in the north of Spain for the inaugural Mammal Watchers meeting. So that should be a lot of fun.
Very exciting. Yes, I hope to see some of you listeners there.
Indeed. So without further ado, we will move right ahead into introducing our next guest. So today I'm delighted to welcome a good friend, Dr. Rob Shumaker, to the podcast. Now, Rob is a man of many talents. He is a world-renowned primatologist with a main focus on great apes. He's a widely published author with several books on primates and conservation. He supervises graduate students at Indiana University. He has a fascination with reptiles. And on top of all that, he is also president and CEO of the Indianapolis Zoo, which is rapidly becoming a major force in global conservation. Rob, welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you here.
Thank you both. I am immensely pleased to be a guest.
Thank you so much for joining us. We're very excited.
Now, what's interesting, Rob, is that when we've spoken to other mammal watchers, it's interesting to hear just how many of them were inspired by visiting zoos when they were children. And in fact, John, I don't know if you remember that we had 3 guests in a row. That was Russ Mittermeier, who, of course, Rob, you know well, Lisa Daybeck, and Alex Meyer, all mentioned their interest in wildlife started by visiting the Bronx Zoo as children.
That's right, yeah.
So, Rob, how did your interest in wildlife start, and what was the path that led you to becoming president of the Indianapolis Zoo?
Well, Charles, I can tell you that I can affirm that perception. So many people tell me that their first experiences and their pivotal experiences of getting into a career related to conservation or science or biology all started by going to the zoo when they were young. And as you might anticipate, a lot of people ask me, how did I get started? How did I get interested? And my answer is honest, but it doesn't sound particularly exciting. I just can't ever remember being interested in anything else. It's the only thing I ever wanted to do. My earliest memories were having a fascination with animals, frankly, all animals. And thank goodness it worked out. I don't know what else I would be doing if it didn't work for me. But I generally have no other recollection at all. And my family affirms it. They say, no, that's all you ever talked about. It's all you ever wanted to do. And I know that's not a very satisfying answer, but in fact, it's true. And I've heard it from some of your guests, and of course, some of my colleagues and coworkers all say the same thing. It's the only thing they ever remember really wanting to do with their lives.
But how did you? I mean, that's fantastic. So to have that dream since you can remember and to be living it now. But what are the steps to becoming a zoo director? Did you study zoo direction in university, or how did you do
that? Amazingly, I did not. So what I would say that I do feel remarkably fortunate because I, of course, know people who don't have any clear interests or any clear passion, and work for them is a drudgery. And I genuinely look forward to what I get to do every single day, and I'm so privileged for that. I think where I would start in terms of how I went forward with my career, I was very, very fortunate to grow up with a mother who thought it was a wonderful idea for me to study animals or to care about animals. I think in a different era, that's a career my mom would have chosen. And I think when I asked her, she is She is passed away now, but when I would ask her, she would have wanted to be a field researcher. She would have loved to go into the wild and study animals. And so she thought it was a wonderful idea. And I never once heard growing up, as unfortunately I think so many people do, oh, well, that's ridiculous. You need to find something that, you know, think about business or think about something where you can make a good salary. I never heard that once. I've known so many people that get derailed because they don't get that kind of support from a parent or a spouse or whatever. So for me, I grew up in the DC area, so we spent many hours at the National Zoo. That was really our only opportunity to see wildlife. And this was in the late 60s and early 70s when I was a young child. So again, going back to my mom, years later, I said, you know, isn't it funny? I don't remember anything about the National Zoo except the great apes. That's the only thing I really remember. I remember parking the car. I remember being around the great apes, and I remember going back to the car. I said, isn't that odd? And my mom's response was, it's not odd at all, because that's the only thing we did. we would get out of the car, go to the apes. She would pack a lunch, and we would sit with the apes for hours and then leave. And she said, we really didn't go anywhere else. We really didn't visit any other parts of the zoo. And part of that was because it was her interest, but also because it was my interest. And of course, in those days, I still think that's fairly remarkable, because there wasn't much interesting to look at. Those were the old days with apes living in essentially a bathroom, you know, blue tiled walls and a tire hanging on a chain, and bars in the front, and that was it. A single ape sitting there and doing very little. Certainly days that I'm happy are long gone. But it was endlessly fascinating to me. So when I was moving into high school, I looked for advice on how I could do this, and of course there was not a lot to know at that time. There's much more information available now, but I think, like everyone else, the advice I was given by well-meaning people was, well, you need to be a veterinarian if you want to work with animals. Mm-hmm. So I was the first person in my extended family to attend college, and so that was still a little bit mysterious. I didn't have anyone who really knew about that could guide me. And so in high school, I got a job at a veterinary clinic, went off to college, back to the point of being the first one in my family to do that. I was completely and totally unprepared financially for what college involved. I was putting myself through, and rapidly realized that wasn't going to work. So I came back to the DC area, was able to get a full-time job working as a keeper at the National Zoo, and started going to school part-time. So I finished to fast forward, I finished my undergraduate and my master's and my PhD all in evolutionary biology. I finished all of those while I was working full-time at the National Zoo, which is not what I would recommend to someone to do, although it has worked out just fine for me. But it made me a very old PhD student, that's for sure. But the part of it was that I was able to have one foot in the academic side and one foot in the practical side simultaneously. And I genuinely think that was unbelievably beneficial for me, because I was able to see things from both perspectives. And I think it made me a much, much better scientist. And wound up being a working scientist at the National Zoo, which is part of the Smithsonian, studying cognitive abilities of great apes. primarily orangutans, also gorillas, and even a little bit with Asian elephants at the time, a little bit with Asian elephants. And then from there, had the opportunity to move to a brand new facility in Des Moines, Iowa. So I jumped at the chance. We had only great apes there, orangutans and bonobos. I ran all the research with bonobos, cognitive research only, behavioral and cognitive research. I was there for 7 years and then was recruited from there to come to the Indianapolis Zoo. And I've been here now for about 13 years. And I became the president and CEO of the zoo here in January of 2020. So as you can tell from that brief overview, I like to stay. So I was at the National Zoo for 20-ish years, in Iowa for 7 years, and now 13 years at the Indianapolis Zoo. And I anticipate and hope that this is the job I will retire from.
That's an amazing story, and so driven with that purpose from the very beginnings of your life. So you talked about some of the work you've done with great apes and orangutans, and the cognitive research. What are some of your most interesting findings on that? Must be fascinating stuff.
From the cognitive research?
Yeah, from the cognitive research or the social behavior.
Yeah, boy, it's a great question. My research with great apes has always focused on one specific area, and that is their ability to use and understand symbols. So how do they go about acquiring, understanding, and then using symbols that represent all kinds of things? Could represent the names of food, the names of objects, verbs, numbers, you name it, any kind of symbolic representation. And that has been always incredibly interesting to me, coming largely out of a fascination with the language projects that involved primarily chimpanzees historically, but of course also gorillas, orangutans, and bonobos. But most of those projects involved chimpanzees. And I was always quite fascinated with that. But by the time I was able to do research on my own, I think the question had become not so interesting about ape language, in the sense that everybody focused on, are they capable of language or not? And the answer is resoundingly yes, they are capable of language, not to the same level of sophistication that, for example, you and I are using right now, but they absolutely can do it. And so there is, to me, no real question to be answered when you frame it as a yes or no. But I think the big overall finding, there's all kinds of individual small findings that are interesting, but the big take homes to me that I think are really quite relevant are that there is wild variation among individuals from even the same parents that grew up in exactly the same circumstances and background in terms of cognitive skill. So we tend to think of, quote unquote orangutans or quote unquote gorillas. Nothing could be further than the truth. There's no such thing as defining them by their species. They're dramatically different from individual to individual in terms of the rates they learn, what they like working on, how consistent they are at the tasks. And there is no easy way to explain it. There are no trends associated with gender. I can't say, oh, males are better than females or females are better than males. It doesn't work. There are no trends associated with age. That was a big preconception that still exists in the literature, that younger apes learn better and faster than older apes. It's not true, certainly not in my research. And then the other one, this one still stuns me. It doesn't matter how much experience an ape has in cognitive testing, when you provide them with a new task that's unfamiliar, there's no benefit to how experienced they are. They're starting fresh and are no better off than any other individual, even if they've done cognitive testing for years and years. It's really very, very task dependent. So I think what it did for me is really helped me understand, and this is any of the great apes, they're all remarkably different. They're all incredibly unique as individuals, surprisingly so, meaning even if they come from exactly the same circumstances and parents, they're remarkably different as individuals. And further, and this is not just from my research, but from understanding the literature, when it comes to cognitive abilities or mental skills with great apes, there is nothing distinctive when you compare them with humans, and I mean it in this way. All of the mental skills and abilities that are present in humans are also present in all of the great apes, although there may be differences in degree. So the way I would phrase it is, when it comes to comparing humans and the other great apes, there are no differences in kind, only differences in degree. I know of no ability in humans that is not also represented in other great apes. And I really wish that I had been the person to first discover that. I think both of you may have heard of the person who first suggested that, a guy named Charles Darwin. So that's a very old idea that I think lots of people have forgotten about. But I would say it's quite true. The last thing that I would tell you is, it is surprising when I consider my own career. I never really had, or early in my career, I had virtually no exposure to conservation, no particular interest or expertise in it, and it just wasn't an emphasis professionally for me or my colleagues early in my career. Things have changed dramatically, of course. But I would say for me, cognitive studies with orangutans were my entree to caring about conservation and biodiversity. And here's why. I became so amazed at the individuals that I was working with, obsessed maybe with understanding more about them and thinking more about their personalities and their mental skills and so on. And then it's slowly dawning on me that any orangutan could do these things. I just happened to be fortunate enough to work with a few individuals. But then I started thinking about orangutans in the wild and realizing the devastation that was being wreaked on their habitats and their populations. Now this was into the 1990s, and that they were literally being decimated in the forests of Southeast Asia. And I thought, how can I not care? I must do something about it. I must be committed. I must care about it, because I was thinking of them through the way I knew the individuals that I worked with. And it was just a revelation to me to say, while I care deeply about cognitive research, conservation has to become a priority in terms of my efforts. And it grew directly out of that. So I guess really what I'm saying is I'm answering a little bit how I got to where I am today, not in terms of a job or responsibilities, but philosophically, what are the things that for me are real priorities that I can focus on personally and also in my role as a zoo CEO.
Yeah, no, I completely get it. I mean, we could talk all day and all for the rest of the week, I think, on cognitive, great apes and this work. It's absolutely fascinating. But one just super quick follow-up question. You spoke about there was no real difference in the abilities of great apes vis-a-vis people, maybe in the scale, but not really in the things they could do. Would you say the same is true for the the character traits of great apes. Like, let's talk about the 7 deadly sins or deadly vices of human character. Do great apes share all of those as well?
You know,
I know they're far too common in people.
yeah, it's such a great question. So while I again would strongly defend this idea of comparing humans and other great apes, and I should be saying humans and other great apes, not humans and great apes, that the mental differences are if there are mental differences, they are in degree, not in kind. You know, I suddenly start to get very hesitant when we talk about, for example, 7 deadly sins or anything in that regard, because at least for humans, that implies questions about morality. And I don't ever apply those kind of standards to great apes. In fact, I would say that, and I have a copy of it, and I can't remember the date. I remember when Time magazine published a photo of a mountain gorilla that had been killed in Rwanda. And they called, and I don't remember which one it was, maybe it was Digit. And the headline was "The Murder of this Mountain Gorilla." And I thought, boy, that's interesting, because I've never seen any major media refer to the killing of a non-human as a murder. And I think that was a real shift at the time in terms of public perception. People started to expand those qualities a bit. Now, by the same token, well, I'll use a gorilla. If a gorilla injured or killed a person, I would never call that assault or murder. I wouldn't apply that morality ever to a non-human. So when it comes to those issues, I really hesitate to think about animal behavior in those terms. And it kind of leads to a much broader topic for me that I'm really sensitized to. And I think it's largely not caused by social media, but has been revealed through social media, that the majority of people don't know how to interpret animal behavior outside of their own perspective. So it's just remarkable to me how often people make assumptions about animal intentions and assertions about, oh, the animal's thinking this, the animal's thinking that. So when probably none of that's true.
So, Rob, I'm sure lots of strange things have happened over the years working in zoos, especially with great apes. But could you tell us 1 or 2 interesting stories you've had from your work in the zoo world?
I can, and when it comes to great apes, I'll tell you 2. One is very short, and the other one's slightly longer, and both involve orangutans. There's one orangutan that I work with named Katie, and she is known for having the very best hair of any orangutan I've ever seen. It is absolutely salon quality, and she is spectacularly beautiful. And we have a wonderful, wonderful rapport. And this was a number of years ago. I've worked with her now for about, I guess, 15, 16 years. There was a day that we were interacting. She was on one side of the mesh, I was on the other side of the mesh. And she was feeling very playful, and that meant she wanted to try and like have me tickle her hands, and she would tickle my hands, and we were playing back and forth, and she was having a good time, I was having a good time. And all of a sudden she flipped her bottom lip open, and I saw a glint of something in there that was metallic, and I didn't know what it was. But of course, you know, if an ape starts showing you pieces of metal, that's concerning because you don't know what they're taking apart, or you don't know if they could hurt themselves. So I looked at her and she was being very playful. And I said, "What is that?" And she reached in her mouth and pulled out my wedding ring and showed it to me and put it back in her mouth. And as we were playing, I had no clue she had stolen my wedding ring off my finger and put it in her mouth. And I never realized it happened. And I think I sounded a little bit like a child because I was so shocked. I said, "Give me that." And so she pulled it out of her mouth and threw it out at me, and it landed on the floor, and she acted immensely pleased with herself. And I thought it was extraordinary that she had done that bit of sleight of hand, and I never even knew that it had happened. So I do have it back, it's still on my finger. The other story that I can tell you about orangutans, and there's a couple of things. Normally, exciting stories about great apes involve escapes. And when you work at the zoo, and this is true for me, the most important thing to say first is, I was off that day, but here's what happened, so that I can immediately say I was not responsible. So I wasn't actually off. I was working in another part of the zoo that day, but I happened to be, this is the National Zoo. And this is documented. This was covered in the media, so I know it's true. And I saw it. As I was walking down the hallway in the building, I was just passing through the building, there was a door that looked into the outdoor yard where the orangutans were, that had a little window. And I looked out the window, and there was an adult female who still lives at the National Zoo. Her name is Bonnie. And she was levitating. And it was remarkable. She was sitting and levitating. And I thought, I didn't know how to understand what I was seeing. So I looked away. I said, no, I'm just not seeing her. I looked back out the window, and she was still levitating. And as I stared at her, the hair on the back of my neck started to go up, because I realized what looked like levitating was actually her sitting in a planter on the public side of the glass. So she was about 3 feet off the ground, and I was seeing her through glass as she was sitting with hundreds of people surrounding her. At the time, she had an infant that was maybe just a few weeks old, and people were coming up and touching the baby and stroking the baby. And I then realized there were no orangutans in the yard, and there should have been several. And so I immediately did what I was supposed to do. I got on the radio, I called everyone, I walked outside, and I couldn't find any orangutans, except Bonnie, who was sitting there with lots of people around her. So I immediately asked the people to move away. And then, I'm not quite sure from where, other orangutans started to appear, all in the public area. And I looked down, and there were no orangutans in the yard, but what I noticed is they had taken 2 55-gallon plastic barrels out into the yard, stacked them up, and just climbed out. So some fantastic tool use. Fast forward, they weren't supposed to have the barrels out in the yard, but a new person was working that day and hadn't quite thought that through, and let them take them outside. Well, they got out. Well, Bonnie and her baby, a male named Kiko, left. So of course, Kiko was hanging on her, and she just climbed onto the roof of the building and disappeared. Couldn't see her, didn't know where she was. The interesting thing, of course, is none of the other orangutans could get back in the yard, because what we realized was the last one out had inadvertently knocked the barrel off so they couldn't climb back in. So they were all stranded out with the visitors. So our vets arrived, which was a little bit intimidating for the orangutans, and they decided to risk it. So they hung on the wall and dropped down much further than they normally would have. We got them all back. We still couldn't find Bonnie. She eventually appeared on the roof and descended down into the yard and went inside. And that's not the exciting part of the story. What happened was we went up on the roof to see if she had damaged anything, and we found a cooler and a bucket of chicken bones and an empty gallon of orange juice. And we were perplexed. And then we looked in the yard and started seeing all kinds of trash, like plastic cups and wrappers and whatever. And none of us had any clue what was going on. And by at this point, it was 3 or 4 in the afternoon. So while I was cleaning up the yard, helping finish up, a visitor came up to the yard and said, "Did you get those apes back?" And we said, "Well, yeah." And they said, "Yeah, we saw them out here." And I said it nicely, but I said, "Did it occur to you that maybe you should tell somebody that they shouldn't be out there wandering around with visitors?" And they said, no, never. I thought it was fine. And I said, "Well, why did you think it was fine?" And they said, "Well, you don't know, they've been doing this for several hours today." And we said, "No." They said, "Oh, they were in and out probably like a dozen times all morning. They'd climb up, and when someone wasn't looking, they'd reach out and take their food and then carry it back into the yard and finish it." And that's where all the souvenir cups had come from. Someone was sitting on a bench enjoying a drink, and the orangutan would come up quietly beside them and just remove the drink and take it back in the yard and finish it. And the person told us, they said, "Yeah, they took somebody's cooler of fried chicken." So they took the entire cooler that was full of fried chicken and a gallon of orange juice and took it up onto the roof of the building and had a picnic, and then came back down and continued to do that all day long. So that was interesting enough that the Washington Post actually did a front page story in their style section about that. And I think ultimately the orangutans had a wonderful time. They enjoyed it immensely, weren't very hungry at the end of the day. But luckily, nobody was injured. Nobody had a problem. All of the apes were fine. Both ape and visitors were all fine. And the rest of us were, frankly, not very surprised, but extremely shaken by the whole experience. And that is the most dramatic great ape escape I've ever been involved in.
Wow,
Amazing. Wow.
that's crazy. So, Rob, zoos have historically played an important role in preventing species extinction. So you can think of species like the European bison, Przewalski's horse, golden-eyed tamarin, which basically would not be here if it was not for being taken into captivity. But that means that with any of these species, first of all, you have to bring them into captivity, and then you have to learn how to breed them. And I was wondering how difficult that is to actually break the sort of breeding code for most species. Are there still many species which don't breed in captivity?
It's so interesting that you asked that, Charles. And of course, I agree strongly with you that accredited zoos have been phenomenally important in saving a number of species and in promoting a whole variety of conservation efforts. Breeding is one of those interesting things because, and at least in the United States, I think these comments can be generally expanded to the European zoos, a lot of the Australian zoos and so on, a lot of the Asian zoos. I can't speak with the same level of detail to those, but accredited zoos share a lot of things in common around the globe. But what I know best are the ones here in North America. We don't take animals out of the wild for our zoos, and we haven't done that for decades. Using orangutans as an example, the last orangutan to come out of the wild that went to a zoo in the United States was almost 50 years ago. So sometime in the early 70s, and that was the very last one. All of our populations are self-sustaining. The only exceptions are that we will take animals, for example, for welfare reasons. So a stranded sea lion that can't be released can come into a zoo. There are cases that I think could fairly be described as controversial, of animals that were going to be culled in the wild, like African elephants or polar bears, black bears, brown bears, that instead were brought into zoo settings. But by and large, that's not how we acquire our animals. We do it through self-sustaining breeding populations. And it's an interesting question to answer, because we've likely tilted towards the species that are easy to reproduce in terms of having them. Now, there are some with challenges, that's for sure, but I would say most species in accredited zoos, mammals and birds, for example, gosh, it would be true for reptiles and amphibians. Probably the ones that are an exception would be fishes. Probably very difficult for some types of fishes, particularly marine. But we don't have really huge challenges with most of the species that we have. Certainly you can find those examples, but by and large, we maintain good social groups. We focus on mother rearing of most species. Again, when I'm talking about mammals, by and large, unless there's a medical issue or some serious behavioral issue, mothers raise their own offspring, and that sets you up for success socially long term, that those individuals become very socially competent and reproductively competent and so on. So while it certainly would be unfair for me to pretend like there are never issues, there are, of course, but by and large, I would say it's reproduction is fairly reliable for many, if not most, of the species we have in zoos, particularly mammals.
So, I mean, that leads on to the question about the zoo's role in conservation beyond breeding more generally. And I know that the zoo is now one of the world leaders in wildlife conservation. So what does that really mean in practice, and how did this transition happen?
Yeah, I can certainly speak in detail about the Indianapolis Zoo. I can also confidently say in general, the accredited zoos, the AZA accredited zoos in the United States are remarkably focused on supporting field conservation, and they do that directly. When I say supporting conservation, I don't mean, for example, having some signage at an exhibit that talks about conservation. I mean, well, that's a good thing, of course, but what I'm referring to is specifically providing resources in some way, usually money, for someone who's doing field conservation work. I know that on an average year, more than $200 million flows from the accredited zoos in the United States to conservation projects around the world. I can say that for us, we approach conservation, we approach our commitment to conservation in 4 specific ways, and all of this entirely consistent with our mission statement, which is simple. Our zoo protects nature and inspires people to care about our world. That's what we're here to do. And we have about 1,200,000 visitors to the zoo here every year. And that's where we start. We start with our on-grounds programming, so that people get great information, have great interactions with our staff, all types of staff here, that talk to them about conservation and our efforts. We also want them to have experiences with our animals, and I love the phrase, experiences that are authentically wondrous. And that's everything from a flamingo to a giraffe, to a hellbender, to an orangutan. We want people to just be enthralled. We've looked at our visitor survey data here, and we know with confidence, and this is just not an opinion, we have the data to show that those experiences significantly change people's attitudes toward supporting field conservation. So that's where we begin. We begin with our on-grounds interpretation. The second thing that we do is a significant portion of our operating budget, hundreds of thousands of dollars every year, is sent directly to field conservation projects around the world. This money goes directly into the hands of the people who are doing the work to conserve species. You name it. We're all over the place, Africa, Asia, so on. But we also do that right here at home. We've focused on projects that are specific to Indiana species, everything from invertebrates to large mammals. It's all equally important to us. So that's one and two. The third way is the Indianapolis Prize. So every 2 years, the Indianapolis Zoo identifies an exceptional conservationist, and we are very specific. It's about an individual. It's not about an organization or a team or so on. It's about an individual who has done remarkable work to save a species or a group of species. One that I think has already been a guest, one of the recipients of the Indianapolis Prize is Russ Mittermeier. One of the champions of conservation, one of the greatest conservationists of our generation. Those are the kind of people that we highlight. So every 2 years, we focus on a recipient for the Indianapolis Prize. It's a competitive process, a juried process, and we invest heavily in promoting that person's work. I should mention that they also receive a $250,000 cash award that they appear to enjoy very much, and that it is an important part of this process, making sure we're supporting their work. They go on a national speaking tour, and in a typical cycle now, we reach more than 3 billion, with a B, 3 billion media impressions related to the recipient of the Indianapolis Prize. We've expanded that a bit. We have 2 awards that are associated with that. One is the Jane Alexander Global Wildlife Ambassador Award. This is a public persona who uses their influence to directly benefit conservation. We give them an award, highlight their work. Past recipients have been Jane Alexander, of course, Sigourney Weaver for her work with mountain gorillas, Harrison Ford, who's an unbelievably committed conservationist, but does it really under the radar. Most recently, the Prince of Monaco, who has had a tremendous personal commitment to marine conservation, and has been a model for what people in power can do to promote a conservation ethic. And then the other one that we are adding to this, and this is the very first year, and I'm pleased that talking to you coincides with an announcement for our new Emerging Conservationist Award. We are maybe completing the circle is one way to look at it here. We are finding and supporting someone who is newer in their career. You have to be under 40 to qualify. This is a person who is doing a phenomenal job at saving a species or group of species. And we have just identified our 10 finalists, and one of them will receive the inaugural Emerging Conservationist Award in September of 2023. Then our very last thing that we do here at the zoo to promote conservation is very new for us. We have a collaboration with the IUCN SSC, and
that's the Species Survival Commission.
Thank you very much. So we are working with the Species Survival Commission and their associated specialist groups to promote and organize that work. And so what we've done is we've created a new department here at the zoo, 10 people strong, and it's organized largely taxonomically, but also by ecosystem. So for example, we have a mammals coordinator, a bird coordinator, an invertebrate coordinator, a plant coordinator, but we also have a freshwater coordinator, marine coordinator. And their purpose is solely to work with the specialist groups of the IUCN Species Survival Commission and help organize and amplify their efforts so that they can be more and more effective. Now that's a permanent new department here. So that my new favorite word is in association with all this is constellation. So that is the constellation of efforts that we have to be true to our mission of protecting nature and inspiring people to care about our world.
So, Rob, if you were to project 30 or 40, maybe even 50 years down the line, what do you think the future zoos are going to look like? Because obviously zoos have changed massively in the last 100 years. So what does that look like to you?
Yeah, it's such an interesting thing to consider. And I would say even in my own lifetime, zoos are almost unrecognizable to what I remember as a kid. And that's a good thing. Zoos have changed only for the better. I think my predictions are probably maybe as short as maybe 10 to 20 years away and then going forward. And again, I can speak really only to the US in this regard. I think there's a couple big trends that are going to happen. One, I think there's going to be many fewer zoos in the future. And I would say, and this may be a surprise to some people listening, but there are at least a couple thousand zoos that are licensed by USDA in the United States. The US Department of Agriculture licenses all public animal facilities, for example. And the majority of those zoos are ones that I would be concerned about. The non-accredited zoos, remember there's about 240, 250 accredited zoos and aquariums that are part of AZA. And outside of that, there are many small kind of privately owned, what we used to call roadside zoos. They're not doing the accredited zoo community any favors, because when we're all painted by the same brush. So when you see a small private zoo that's poor, everyone assumes that characterizes all zoos. Well, nothing could be further from the truth. So I think what we're going to see over time, the majority of those small unaccredited organizations are going to close and fade away, and I think that's a very good thing. So we'll have far fewer zoos. The other thing is I believe zoos are going to start, at least to a degree, we're going to see more specialization. Instead of, and I'll use African elephants or Asian elephants as a conspicuous example. Instead of seeing zoos that each have 2, 3, or 4 elephants each, I think we're going to see zoos with larger and larger herds, and that means fewer zoos are going to have those species. And I think that's a good thing. And you could say the same thing for all kinds of other species as you go along. So I think we're going to see those trends of greater specialization, higher and higher quality, and higher standards. And all of that benefits the zoo community, benefits visitors, benefits the animals, and benefits all of our conservation efforts that are associated with that.
And then one final question for you. If there's one animal, let's say one mammal that you could bring into the zoo, what would it be?
That is an extraordinarily difficult question. I think maybe I can answer in two ways. I can answer, oh gosh, I don't know. Let me just tell you what I'm thinking. There's a species we don't have that I would love for us to have, and that's okapi.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if this translates for most people, but it certainly does for me. Is to me, okapi, I think, are as close as you can get to something that is truly mythical.
Mm-hmm.
They don't seem like they could possibly be real. And then if you ever have the good fortune to touch one, their hair, their fur, it literally feels like velvet.
Wow.
They are the most remarkable, beautiful, incredible animals that I think could ever be imagined. So that's one.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm going to shift wildly now and say two more things. I think if you tell the story right, and if you explain it properly, any mammal, really any species, but any mammal can be extraordinarily compelling for a zoo visitor. You just have to know what you're talking about, and you have to really identify what's authentically wondrous about that species. But now I'll give you the real answer, and I'll tell you why. I think it would be chimpanzees. We don't have chimpanzees for visitors here at the zoo, and I would very much like that to happen. And here's why, for two reasons. Chimpanzees are so grossly misunderstood and have been so mischaracterized, largely by the media, for generations, that I think it's quite hard to find people who really understand and admire chimpanzees. They are absolutely extraordinary, of course. So I'd like to try and correct those misperceptions that people have about chimpanzees. Now, of course, we have spectacular orangutans here at the zoo, but they don't come with those same misperceptions. People don't regard them the same way they regard chimpanzees. But the other big question for me, the other big factor, is that chimpanzees have the ability to make people extraordinarily uncomfortable. When you see a chimpanzee and look in their eyes and look at them directly, lots of people find that a very, very disconcerting experience.
Because of the similarities with humans?
Absolutely. They're not prepared to look at another species and realize it's just a whisper of a difference between us. And that's there with orangutans and bonobos and gorillas, but it's even more magnified with chimpanzees. And I think that's actually a great thing for people to experience, because it suddenly makes you realize we have an enormous responsibility to the natural world. And the decisions that humans make really determine whether or not a species will survive, certainly in the wild. And chimpanzees are the species that I think of that are the ones that are the most compelling in terms of making people question our authority and our influence and our power over the rest of the natural world. And so in that regard, I think it's a really important thing for people to have that experience. Now, what goes along with that with chimpanzees too is they're absolutely extraordinary individuals. It's an extraordinary species. There's so much to learn and so much to appreciate. That would be the species I would say that I would most like us to have here at our zoo and give that experience to visitors, and give a really, really spectacular proper home to a community of chimpanzees.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think most mammal watchers would agree with you on the okapi front. That is also the holy grail for mammal watchers, in that, first of all, in order to see one, you've got to sort of fight your way through a war-torn country with rebels all over the place. And then when you actually get there, they're really, really hard to find. Yeah. So those two factors mean that basically it's one of those species that hardly anyone's ever seen in the wild. So, well, here's hoping that one day you'll get both chimpanzees and okapis into the zoo.
That'd be fantastic.
Rob, thank you so much for this. It's been absolutely fascinating insight, both into your work with great apes, but also the work of zoos and how they may or may not change in the future. So thank you so much for taking the time for being with us.
Yeah, it's been absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Thank you, John. Thank you, Charles, and please continue your wonderful, wonderful work promoting conservation and promoting an interest in biodiversity, especially mammals. I'm so appreciative of what you're doing. Thank you.
You've been listening to Mammal Watching with Charles Foley and John Hall. You can find other episodes at mammalwatching.com/podcast.